Good afternoon, Honorable Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. My name is David Kogan. Your office has retained the services of my firm in order to introduce the new 2021 proposed wampum belt design for the upcoming Royal Proclamation. The goal of this presentation is to introduce the new wampum belt design, which will hopefully renew the nation-to-nation relationship between Canada and the Indigenous people. This presentation will proceed in three parts. The first part will explain the historical and social context of indigeneity in Canada, including the issues affecting the Indigenous people in the present day. The second part will display and illustrate the new wampum belt design and the reasons for the symbolisms on the belt. The last part will outline proposed recommendations and steps to take moving forward. I would like to begin by providing you with a brief overview of the issues that Indigenous people faced in the past and continue to face in our society today. Colonization has been an identified legal and social issue that impacted and continues to impact the Indigenous people and community greatly. The Indigenous community has been disregarded, abused, and dehumanized by the Canadian healthcare system, education system, justice system, and overall political system. All of these issues began with colonization and the doctrine of discovery. By completely disregarding the Indigenous people that already lived on the land, settlers considered Canada an empty land that is free to take over. They used the doctrine of discovery in order to politically and legally seize the land. What is worse is that settlers further used their incorrect belief in order to make laws in every system to eliminate the Indigenous community in a silent manner. Colonialism resulted in cultural disconnection, territorial disposition, systemic oppression, systematic discrimination, and socioeconomic marginalization, all of which continue to negatively influence the lives of many Indigenous people today. This has had complicated and tragic consequences for many, including high rates of serious illnesses, mental health issues, suicide, abuse and violence, alcohol and drug abuse, and involvement in the criminal justice system as both victims and as convicted persons. Indigenous people are over-policed, and there's a lack of prosecution for crimes committed against Indigenous people. This can be easily seen with the story of Colton Bushy. Indigenous individuals tend to be more frequently targeted by police, resulting in more court appearances than in non-Indigenous persons. At the same time, Indigenous people are perceived as less deserving victims by the police. Their trustworthiness being questioned, and their calls for aid are being disregarded and undersupported. The criminal justice system in Canada is founded on Western principles, and Indigenous legal orders are seldom recognized in the system. Their values differ with regards to their approaches to reaching justice. Indigenous laws are significant for judging relationships with the land and one another. However, they're rarely given any authority. Although both Indigenous and Western forms of justice involve the concepts of deterrence, repudiation, incarceration, and rehabilitation, the ways in which these principles are used and the measures taken to remedy wrongdoing or injury differ. For Indigenous people, for example, justice is relational. The emphasis is on relationships, restoring communal harmony and balance, and resolving harm via healing and reintegration. For almost a century, Indigenous knowledge has been abused and interfered with, beginning with residential schools and continuing into modern educational institutions. Residential schools were used by the government to convert Indigenous people into the dominant culture, which resulted in severe child maltreatment, disruption of integrational transfer of old knowledge, and cultural genocide. They were put in place by the Crown solely for the purpose of whitewashing and culturally eliminating Indigenous people and their cultures through hateful actions. Children were deprived of their culture, customs, language, and connection to their homeland as a result of these institutions. Many Canadians regard Canada's universal healthcare system to be among the greatest in the world. The system's main goal is to defend, promote, and restore the physical and mental well-being of Canadian residents. as well as to ensure adequate access to healthcare without financial or other impediments. Access to universal health services that is reasonable and equitable allows for early diagnosis, decreases mortality, and improves physical, mental, emotional, and social results. However, while access to healthcare is widely acknowledged as a key factor of health, it is not evenly or readily accessible to all Canadians. Indigenous people in particular continue to face impediments to healthcare, resulting in severe and persistent health inequalities when compared to other Canadians. The struggle to access health services on reserves was only highlighted these past few years by the COVID-19 pandemic, as the percentage of COVID cases were much higher than the off-reserve Canadian population. I also have to mention that Indigenous waterways are still being entangled in colonial capitalist resource exploitation on a global scale. This leads to having communities being left without their basic human right of clean water. Overall, this simply shows a disregard for the lives of Indigenous people. The goal of this belt should be to recognize Canada's troubled past and persecution of Indigenous people, while also advocating a commitment to reconciliation based on Indigenous legal tradition in the future. The symbolism of the belt begins on the left, where it shows purple Canadian and Indigenous people on a wavy route. The usage of wavy lines and the color choice are emblematic of the government's volatile relationship with the Indigenous peoples. The second section of the belt illustrates the crossing of the two lines as the lines proceed. The day our proposed proclamation takes effect, this signifies the creation of a respectful relationship between both sides. Indigenous and Canadian people shift in the two rows, symbolizing an aim of mutual and peaceful coexistence. This is not to be confused with assimilation. The two parallel lines indicate cohabitation and respect for each other's culture and traditions in a shared space where each party is free to pursue its own course. Lastly, the final section of the belt symbolizes the acceptance of shared responsibility for maintaining peace, collaboration, and respect. This is demonstrated by the dish with one spoon symbol. One half of the bowl with one spoon symbol will be placed at either end of our planned belt. The emblem and the belt will create a circle when both ends of the belt are brought together. The bowl and spoon symbol is used to illustrate how land may be shared to benefit all of its residents. This shows the physical depiction of the government's vow to keep its promises for all time by connecting both ends to make a full circle. As part of the recommendations, first, an apology by yourself should be issued on Canada's behalf to the Indigenous people for the unspeakable atrocities that occurred in the past. It is important for Canada to start on the right foot this time and start the new partnership by taking another look at the 94 calls to action that was offered to the Canadian government by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2015. It would be incredible to legitimately reignite the connection with the Indigenous people, and by doing this properly first, by you and your duties as Prime Minister, will go down in history to be forever praised. There are a few calls to action that I would like to stress a little bit more, however. I would like you and your government to take a look at calls to action 6 to 12, 18 to 24, and 25 to 42, as they call upon your federal government to right a few wrongs in regards to the education, health, and justice system mentioned above. I call on you to pressure the churches to abolish and rescind the doctrine of discovery. I call on you to abolish the Indian Act and the apartheid system. And I call on you to give the Indigenous people their land, culture, and language back so that they can be a true nation once again. More importantly, I call on you, Mr. Prime Minister, to issue an annual report which would outline yours and the government's plans for advancing the cause for reconciliation, as well as to put into detail the ways in which you will do so. An apology that isn't accompanied by action is disingenuous. It will simply serve as a symbol for the government's continued disregard for Indigenous peoples. A treaty that incorporates the following proposals will improve both sides' relationships and help them move closer to reconciliation. This proclamation should take the form of the Wampum Belt, and it should demonstrate your unwavering commitment to Indigenous peoples' acceptance, equality, and camaraderie as the leader of our federal government in Canada. While the Wampum Belt is an Indigenous tradition, the Prime Minister and the federal government should recognize its significance for relations between itself and Indigenous people in Canada. It should be given the same weight as any other legal agreement recognized by Canadian courts. The government should openly recognize the significance and legitimacy of the Wampum Belt as a symbol of acknowledgement, reaffirmation, and commitment to a constructive relationship between Indigenous people and the government. It is time to acknowledge that no matter the race, religion, culture, or ethnicity, we're all human beings and we all deserve to be treated equally, not just by the law on the books, but also in action. Thank you.